The December wind cut across the Montana territory like a blade forged in the coldest depths of winter, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that could freeze a man's breath in his lungs. Samuel Cross stood on the porch of his ranch house, his broad frame silhouetted against the dying light of late afternoon, watching the last remnants of golden sun disappear behind the snow-capped peaks that had been his constant companions for the past 14 years. At 28 years old, Samuel Cross was a man who had built an empire from nothing. Silver Creek Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime Montana grazing land, home to 500 head of the finest cattle in the territory. The ranch house he'd constructed with his own two hands stood solid and imposing, built from logs he'd cut himself from the forest that bordered his property. 3 hired men worked his land, good men who respected him and feared him in equal measure. By every measurable standard, Samuel Cross was a success. And yet as he stood there watching the sun sink below the horizon, he felt nothing but the hollow ache of a man who had everything and nothing at all. 5 years. It had been 5 years since Sarah had died, 5 years since the fever had taken her weak body and freed them both from a marriage that had been doomed from its very beginning. Samuel could still remember the relief he'd felt standing at her graveside, knowing that she was finally at peace and that he would no longer have to witness the daily evidence of her misery. It was a terrible thing to feel relief at a spouse's death, but Samuel had learned long ago that terrible truths were still truths. Sarah had been the daughter of a man who owed Samuel's father money, a debt that could only be repaid through marriage. She had come to Montana expecting a different life, expecting that her beauty and her tears would convince Samuel to abandon his ranch and move to San Francisco or Denver to take up some respectable profession that wouldn't leave dirt under his fingernails and the smell of cattle on his clothes. For 3 years, she had made both their lives miserable with her constant complaints, her tears, her accusations that he cared more about his cattle than he did about her. And the worst part was she had been right. Samuel had cared more about his cattle than about a woman who despised everything he had worked to build. How could he not? The sound of hoofbeats pulled Samuel from his dark thoughts. Tom, his youngest hand, rode up to the porch, his horse's breath coming in great clouds of steam in the frigid air. Tom was barely 22, eager and hardworking, with a quick smile and a quicker draw. Samuel had hired him 2 years ago and had never regretted the decision. Boss Tom called out, swinging down from his saddle with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle. Got the north fence repaired. Should hold through the winter storms. Good work, Samuel said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. The cattle settled in for the night. Yes, sir. Jake's doing final rounds now. Tom hesitated, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in a way that told Samuel something was on the young man's mind. Boss, can I ask you something? Samuel turned his dark eyes on Tom, waiting. Is it true what Pete said, that you're sending for a mail-order bride? The words hung in the cold air between them, and Samuel felt something tighten in his chest. He should have known the news would spread among his men. In a place as isolated as Silver Creek Ranch, there were no secrets. It's true, Samuel said simply. Tom's eyes widened. But boss, after what happened with Miss Sarah, I mean Mrs. Cross, I just thought you'd never want to go through that again. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting back to the mountains. What happened with Sarah was my own fault, he said finally. I married a woman who didn't want this life, who didn't want me. I thought I could make it work through sheer force of will. I was wrong. So why do it again? Tom asked, genuine confusion in his young voice. Why not just stay as you are? Because a man can build an empire, Samuel said slowly, choosing his words with care. He can own thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle, have money in the bank, and respect in town. But if he has no one to share it with, no one to build it for, then what's the point? It's just wood and dirt and animals. It means nothing. Tom was silent, absorbing this. But how do you know this one will be different? I don't, Samuel admitted. But this time I'm not looking for someone to change for me or someone I need to change for them. I'm looking for a partner, someone who wants to build something together, someone who can see this life for what it really is and choose it anyway. Tom nodded slowly, though Samuel could see the doubt in his eyes. Well, I hope she works out, boss. This place could use a woman's touch. Gets pretty lonely up here in the winter. That it does, Samuel agreed. That it does. After Tom rode off toward the bunkhouse, Samuel remained on the porch, his calloused hands gripping the railing he'd carved from solid oak. The wood was smooth under his work-worn palms, worn by years of his own touch. Everything on this ranch bore the mark of his labor, every fence post, every board, every stone in the chimney. He had built this place from nothing, transformed raw wilderness into something productive and valuable. But what was the value of it all if he had no heir to pass it to? No son to teach the ways of ranching? No daughter to spoil and protect, no wife to share the burden and the joy of building something that would outlast them both? Samuel pulled the letter from his pocket, the paper worn soft from being read and reread a dozen times. The words were brief, written in a careful, educated hand that spoke of someone who had learned their letters well, but had not had much opportunity to use them. Dear Mr. Cross, the letter began. My name is Clara Hartwell. I am 23 years old, unmarried, and recently orphaned. I have worked in service for most of my life and am experienced in cooking, cleaning, sewing, and household management. I am healthy and strong, despite my small stature. I ask for nothing except a roof over my head and to be treated with basic human decency. If these terms are acceptable to you, I am willing to travel to Montana Territory to become your wife. Yours respectfully, Clara Hartwell. There was something in those simple words that had called to Samuel. No false promises of love, no flowery descriptions of her own beauty or charm, no demands for luxury or comfort. Just a straightforward proposal from someone who seemed to understand that this was a practical arrangement built on mutual need rather than romantic fantasy. Samuel had written back immediately, enclosing a train ticket and enough money for travel expenses. He had told her the truth about himself, about the ranch, about the isolation and the hard work and the long Montana winters. He had told her he was a widower, that his first marriage had been unhappy, that he was a large man who could be intimidating to those who didn't know him. He had promised her respect, fair treatment, and a monthly wage on top of room and board so that she would never be trapped if things didn't work out. And then he had waited, wondering if she would come, wondering if she would take one look at him in his ranch and decide she'd made a terrible mistake. The answer had come 3 weeks later. A simple telegram arriving December 20th. Clara Hartwell. December 20th was tomorrow. Samuel looked out at his ranch, at the empire he had built with his own 2 hands, and for the first time in 5 years, he felt something other than the dull ache of loneliness. He felt hope, in fear, and a desperate prayer that this time, he might get it right. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that made the snow squeak under a man's boots and froze the moisture in his nose with every breath. Samuel rose before dawn, as he had every day for as long as he could remember, and went through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Feed the horses, check the cattle, break the ice on the water troughs, make sure his men were awake and ready for the day's work. But today was different. Today his mind was not on the work, but on the woman who would be arriving at noon, the stranger who had agreed to become his wife sight unseen. Samuel had bathed the night before, scrubbing himself raw with lye soap until his skin was pink and tender. This morning he shaved carefully, using the straight razor that had been his father's, trimming his beard close to his jaw and cutting his hair as best he could manage. He dressed in his best clothes, dark wool pants and a clean flannel shirt, suspenders instead of a belt, his good boots polished to a shine that seemed almost obscene for a working ranch. Jake found him in the barn adjusting his collar for the 10th time. The older man, weathered and wise, with 50 years of hard living etched into every line of his face, watched with something that might have been amusement. Nervous boss Jake asked, his voice rough as gravel. Samuel's hands stilled on his collar. Should I be? Well, Jake said, leaning against a stall door. You're about to marry a woman you've never met. I'd say that's cause for a little nervousness. I've done it before, Samuel pointed out. And how'd that work out for you? Samuel couldn't argue with that. Point taken. Jake pulled out a plug of tobacco, worked off a piece, and tucked it into his cheek. For what it's worth, boss, I think you're doing the right thing. A man needs a woman, a ranch needs a woman. Place gets too hard without that softness to balance it out. What if she takes one look at me and decides she's made a mistake? Samuel asked, voicing the fear that had kept him awake most of the night. I'm not exactly what most women dream of. Jake snorted. You're a good man, Samuel Cross. You're fair. You're honest. You work harder than any 3 men I know. And you've got more integrity in your little finger than most men have in their whole body. Any woman with sense will see that. But what if she doesn't have sense? What if she's like Sarah? Then you give her the money to leave, and you try again, Jake said simply. But I got a feeling about this one, boss. Something tells me she's made of sterner stuff than Miss Sarah was. Has to be to come all this way to marry a man she's never met. That takes guts. Samuel nodded, though his stomach was still churning with anxiety. He wasn't a man who scared easily. He'd faced down wolves and bears, had stared down rustlers and cattle thieves, had weathered blizzards that would have killed a lesser man. But the thought of Clara Hartwell arriving at noon of her, seeing him for the first time, of the potential disappointment in her eyes, that terrified him more than anything he'd ever faced. At 11:30, Samuel hitched his best horse to the wagon and drove into town. The settlement of Silver Creek was hardly worthy of the name town, just a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a few scattered houses. But it had a train depot, and that was all that mattered today. The train was late, as trains often were in winter, and Samuel spent 30 minutes pacing the platform, his broad shoulders drawing curious looks from the few townspeople who were out in the cold. Mrs. Henderson from the general store watched him with barely concealed interest, no doubt already preparing the gossip she would spread about Samuel Cross and his mail-order bride. Samuel ignored her. He'd long since learned that people would talk no matter what he did, that his size and his success in his first failed marriage made him a subject of endless speculation. Let them talk, it changed nothing. The train whistle sounded in the distance, a lonely cry that echoed across the frozen landscape. Samuel's heart began to pound, a heavy drumbeat that seemed to shake his entire chest. This was it. In a few minutes, he would meet the woman who had agreed to share his life, to take on the burden of being his wife, to help him build the legacy he so desperately wanted to create. Please, he prayed silently to a God he rarely spoke to. Please let this be right. The train pulled into the station in a cloud of steam and smoke, its brakes squealing against the rails. Samuel stood on the platform, his hands clenched at his sides, watching as passengers began to disembark. A businessman in a suit, a farmer with his family, two young men who looked like they were heading to the mines. And then he saw her. She stepped down from the train with careful, measured movements that spoke of exhaustion and cold. She wore a threadbare coat that had seen better days, a simple brown dress beneath it, and a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was pale with cold, and what Samuel suspected was fear. But it was her eyes that caught him. Gray eyes, clear and direct, that scanned the platform until they found him. And when they did, Samuel saw her entire body go still, saw her take in his size, his breath, the sheer physical presence of him. For a moment, he was certain she would turn and get back on the train. For a moment, he was certain this had all been a terrible mistake. But then she lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and walked toward him, her single battered trunk being carried by a porter who followed in her wake. "Mr. Cross," she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor Samuel could see in her hands. "Miss Hartwell," he replied, his own voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. "Welcome to Montana." Up close, she was even smaller than he'd thought, barely reaching the middle of his chest, even when she stood as tall as she could manage. Her face was thin, her features more severe than beautiful, with high cheekbones and a straight nose that gave her an almost regal bearing, despite her obvious poverty. But it was still her eyes that held him, those steady gray eyes that met his without flinching, without fear, just a careful assessment. "You're very large," she said, and Samuel couldn't tell if it was an observation or an accusation. "I am," he agreed. "I should have mentioned that in my letters. I'm sorry if it's frightening." "I'm not frightened," Clara said, and Samuel believed her. Surprised, perhaps, but not frightened. The porter set her trunk down with a thump. "That'll be 50 cents for the carrying," he said, his eyes flicking between Samuel and Clara with barely concealed curiosity. Samuel handed him $1. "Keep the change." The porter tipped his hat and hurried away, no doubt eager to spread the news about Samuel Cross and his tiny mail-order bride. "Is this all you brought?" Samuel asked, gesturing to the single trunk. "It's all I have," Clara said simply, without shame or apology. "I'm not a woman of means, Mr. Cross. I thought I made that clear in my letters." "You did," Samuel assured her. "I just wanted to make sure nothing was left on the train." He bent and lifted her trunk with one hand as easily as if it weighed nothing at all, and saw Clara's eyes widen slightly. "The wagon's this way," he said, starting toward where he'd left it, tied at the edge of the platform. Clara followed her steps, quick to keep up with his longer stride. Samuel slowed, suddenly aware that he was walking too fast, that his natural pace would leave her struggling to keep up. "I apologize," he said. "I forget sometimes that not everyone is as tall as I am." A smile flickered across Clara's face there, and gone so quickly Samuel almost missed it. That must be quite a disadvantage in doorways. It was such an unexpected comment that Samuel actually laughed, a deep sound that seemed to surprise them both. "I've learned to duck," he said. He helped her up into the wagon, his hands careful on her waist, trying not to think about how small she felt, how delicate. She settled onto the seat, arranging her skirts with precise movements, and Samuel took his place beside her, suddenly very aware of the space he took up, of how his bulk must seem next to her small frame. "It's about an hour's ride to the ranch," he said, taking up the reins. "If you get too cold, there's a blanket under the seat." "Thank you," Clara said, pulling the blanket out and wrapping it around her legs. "The cold here is different from back east. It goes right through you." "Montana winters are hard," Samuel agreed, guiding the horse onto the road that led out of town. "They're long and they're brutal, and they'll test everything you've got, but they're also beautiful in their own way. There's a peace in the silence of snow, a clarity you can't find anywhere else." "You sound like a poet," Clara observed. Samuel's ears burned, and he found himself studying the grain of the wooden seat with intense focus. "My mother loved poetry. She used to read to me when I was small. I guess some of it stuck." "That's nothing to be embarrassed about," Clara said. "A man who appreciates beauty is a man who sees the world clearly." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the creak of the wagon, the clip-clop of the horse's hooves on the frozen road, and the whistle of the wind across the open landscape. Samuel snuck glances at Clara from the corner of his eye, trying to read her expression, trying to gauge what she thought of this harsh, beautiful land she'd agreed to make her home. "What made you answer my advertisement?" he asked, finally unable to contain his curiosity any longer. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "Necessity," she said finally. "When my aunt died 6 months ago, she left me with nothing but debts. I had a choice to make, the workhouse or marriage. I chose what I hoped would be dignity." Samuel's hands tightened on the reins. "You should know that I don't see you as a servant or a possession. You'll be my wife, my partner. I meant what I said in my letters about the wage. I want you to have your own money, your own independence. If this doesn't work out, if you're unhappy, I want you to have the means to leave." "Why?" Clara asked, turning to look at him fully for the first time. "Why would you give me that option? Most men in your position would want to ensure their wife couldn't leave." "Because I've already lived in a marriage where one person wanted to leave and couldn't," Samuel said quietly. "It destroyed us both. I won't do that again. I want a wife who stays because she wants to, not because she has no choice." Clara studied his face with those clear gray eyes. "You're not what I expected, Mr. Cross." "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone harder, perhaps. More demanding. Men of means usually are." "I'm not a man of means," Samuel said. "I'm a man who works hard and has been lucky enough to see that work pay off. But I remember what it's like to have nothing. My parents died when I was 14. I worked other people's ranches for years before I saved enough to buy this land. I know what it's like to be cold and hungry and desperate. I won't forget that." The ranch came into view as they crested a hill, and Samuel heard Clara's sharp intake of breath. He tried to see it through her eyes, the sprawling log house with smoke curling from its chimneys, the massive barn and corrals, the outbuildings scattered across the valley, the cattle dotting the white landscape like dark stones against snow. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly, and Samuel heard genuine wonder in her voice. "It's home," he said simply. "Or at least I hope it will be for you too." As they drew closer, Samuel saw his 3 hired men emerge from the barn, drawn by the sound of the wagon. Tom was grinning, Jake was trying to hide a smile, and Pete stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face carefully neutral. Samuel pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and jumped down, then turned to help Clara. His hands spanned her waist completely, and he lifted her down as gently as he could, setting her on her feet in the snow. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice taking on the tone of authority he used when giving orders. "This is Miss Clara Hartwell, who's come from back east to be my wife. Clara, these are my men, Tom, Jake, and Pete." "Ma'am," the 3 men chorused, removing their hats in a gesture of respect. Clara nodded to each of them. "I'm pleased to meet you. I hope we'll work well together." Samuel saw the surprise flicker across his men's faces. They'd been expecting someone like Sarah, someone who would look down on them, who would treat them as inferior. Clara's simple acknowledgement of them as equals, as colleagues in the running of the ranch, clearly caught them off guard. Pete Samuel said, "Could you bring Miss Hartwell's trunk into the house?" "Tom, Jake, I'll need you both to finish the evening chores. I'll be out to help shortly." "Yes, boss," they said in unison, Tom still grinning like a fool, Jake nodding with approval, Pete simply doing as he was told. Samuel turned to Clara. "Come inside, you must be freezing." He led her up the porch steps and through the front door into the main room of the house. Samuel watched her take it all in the stone fireplace, dominating one wall. The furniture he'd built himself, the kitchen area with its cast-iron stove and hand-hewn table. The house was clean and well-maintained, but it lacked softness, lacked the feminine touches that turned a house into a home. "I prepared a bedroom for you upstairs," Samuel said, suddenly nervous again. "First door on the right. It was my—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "It's the best room in the house." "And where will you sleep?" Clara asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I've moved my things to the room at the end of the hall," Samuel said. "I thought you'd want your own space, at least for now." Relief flickered across Clara's face. "Thank you, that's very considerate." They stood there in awkward silence, and Samuel realized he had no idea what to do next. All his planning, all his preparation, and he hadn't thought past getting Clara to the ranch. "Are you hungry?" he asked finally. "I could heat up some stew." "I am actually," Clara said. The train didn't have much in the way of food. Samuel moved to the kitchen, ladling stew from the pot that hung over the fire into 2 bowls. He was intensely aware of Clara watching him, of her presence in his home, of the strangeness of having a woman here again after so many years of solitude. They sat at the table and Samuel watched as Clara tasted the stew. Her eyebrows rose in surprise. "This is excellent," she said. "You're a good cook." "I've been feeding myself for 5 years," Samuel said. "You learn or you starve." "5 years," Clara repeated softly. "That's how long you've been a widower." "Yes." "What was she like?" "Your first wife." Samuel considered lying, considered painting a picture of a marriage that hadn't been the disaster it was. But something about Clara's direct gaze made him want to tell the truth. "We weren't happy together," he said finally. "She was the daughter of a man who owed my father money. Our marriage was arranged to settle the debt. She hated Montana, hated the ranch, hated the isolation. She wanted me to sell everything and move to the city. When I refused, we became enemies living under the same roof. For 3 years, we made each other miserable. Then she caught fever and died. I know it's terrible to say, but we were both relieved when it ended." Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry you had to live through that." "So am I," Samuel said, "which is why I'm determined not to repeat those mistakes. I don't want a wife who's here because she has to be. I want someone who chooses this life, who sees value in what we're building here. And if I don't, if I decide this isn't for me, then I'll give you enough money to start over somewhere else," Samuel said firmly. "I meant what I said in my letters, Clara. You're not trapped here. You are not a possession I've purchased. You're a person with your own will, and I'll respect that." Clara set down her spoon and looked at him with an expression Samuel couldn't quite read. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met or the biggest fool." "Maybe I'm both," Samuel said with a slight smile. After they finished eating, Samuel helped Clara clear the dishes, their movements falling into an easy rhythm that surprised them both. When the kitchen was clean, Samuel glanced toward the stairs. "It's been a long day for you," he said. "You must be exhausted from the journey. Let me show you to your room." He carried Clara's trunk upstairs while she followed with a lamp, the wooden steps creaking softly beneath their feet. The bedroom was spacious, dominated by a large bed covered with a quilt his mother had made before she died. A dresser, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the ranch completed the furnishings. "There should be extra blankets in the chest," Samuel said, setting the trunk at the foot of the bed. "It gets cold at night, even with the fires going." "Thank you," Clara said softly. Samuel moved toward the door, then paused, his hand on the frame. "Clara." "Yes." He turned back, and in the lamplight he could see the exhaustion in her face, the uncertainty, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "I know this isn't what most women dream of. Marrying a stranger, coming to a place you've never seen, living with a man who looks like he gestured at himself helplessly, like this. But I promise you, I'll try to make it as comfortable as I can. I'll never hurt you. I'll never raise a hand to you or force anything you're not ready for." Clara's eyes softened. "You've been nothing but kind since I arrived. I appreciate that more than you know." Samuel nodded, relief flooding through him. "Sleep well, Clara. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure out the rest." He left, closing the door gently behind him, and made his way to his own room at the end of the hall. The small room felt cramped after years of sleeping in the master bedroom, but Samuel didn't mind. He'd sleep in the barn if it meant Clara felt safe and comfortable. As he prepared for bed, Samuel could hear the faint sounds of Clara moving around in her room, the creak of floorboards, the splash of water in the basin. He thought about her direct gray eyes, her straightforward manner, the way she'd stood up to him despite her obvious fear. She wasn't what he'd expected. She was stronger, braver, more complex than the simple words of her letter had suggested. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Samuel felt something that might have been hope. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains, painting Clara's room in shades of pale gold and silver. She woke to unfamiliar sounds, the low of cattle in the distance, the whinny of horses, the creak of floorboards as someone moved through the house below. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all came rushing back. Montana, Silver Creek Ranch, Samuel Cross, her husband. Well, not quite her husband yet. The Reverend was coming this afternoon to make it official. Clara rose and dressed quickly in the cold room, her breath forming small clouds in the air. She'd slept surprisingly well despite her exhaustion and anxiety lulled by the profound silence of the Montana night, so different from the constant noise of the city she'd left behind. The bed had been the most comfortable she'd slept in for years, the quilts thick and warm, and she'd felt for the first time in months truly safe. Downstairs, she found Samuel already at the stove cooking breakfast. He looked up when she entered, and she saw surprise flicker across his face as if he hadn't expected her to rise so early. "Good morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "Coffee's ready if you want some." "Thank you," Clara said, pouring herself a cup from the pot on the stove. The coffee was strong and black, exactly the way she liked it. "What time does the Reverend arrive?" "Around noon," Samuel said, flipping bacon in the cast-iron skillet with practiced ease. "We'll have a simple ceremony, just the two of us and whatever witnesses he brings. Unless you want something more." "No," Clara said firmly. "Simple is fine. I've never been one for grand occasions." She watched him cook, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way those powerful hands handled the delicate work of cracking eggs without breaking the yolks. There was a grace to him that seemed at odds with his size, a careful precision that suggested a man who had learned to control his strength. "Can I help?" she asked. Samuel glanced at her, then gestured to the cupboard. "Plates are in there, utensils in the drawer below." They worked together in comfortable silence, Clara setting the table while Samuel finished cooking. When they sat down to eat, Clara found herself genuinely hungry for the first time in days. The anxiety that had knotted her stomach during the long train journey had eased, replaced by a cautious optimism. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, between bites of bacon. "How did you build all this?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, his coffee cup looking absurdly small in his hand. "I bought the land 14 years ago when I was barely more than a boy. 500 acres for next to nothing because no one else wanted it. The previous owner had given up, said the land was too hard, the winters too brutal, the wolves too aggressive. But I saw potential." He stared out the window at his domain, and Clara saw pride flicker across his face. "The first year I lived in a tent while I built the barn. Figured the animals needed shelter more than I did. The second year I started the house. Took me 3 years to finish it, working alone, cutting every log myself, hauling every stone for the chimney. By the 5th year, I had 50 head of cattle. Now I have 500. "That's remarkable," Clara said, and she meant it. "Most men couldn't accomplish in a lifetime what you've done in 14 years. "Most men have help," Samuel said quietly. "They have fathers to teach them, brothers to work alongside them, wives to support them. I had nothing but stubborn determination and a refusal to fail." Clara studied him across the table, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. This wasn't just a lonely rancher who needed a housekeeper. This was a man who had built an empire from nothing through sheer force of will, who had survived losses that would have broken lesser men, who had learned to be completely self-sufficient because he'd had no other choice. "Why do you want to share it now?" she asked. "You've proven you can do it alone. Why bring someone else into it?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Because what's the point of building something if there's no one to pass it to? What good is an empire if it dies with me? I want sons to teach ranching, daughters to protect and spoil. I want to build something that lasts beyond my own life, and I can't do that alone." "So you need an heir," Clara said, understanding. "I need a family," Samuel corrected gently. "There's a difference. An heir is just someone to inherit property. A family is people you love, people you die for, people who make all the work and struggle worthwhile." Clara's breath caught, and warmth spread through her chest like sunrise breaking over the mountains. She'd expected pragmatism, had prepared herself for a purely transactional arrangement. But Samuel's words spoke of something deeper, something more vulnerable than she'd anticipated. "What do you want from this marriage?" Samuel asked, his dark eyes meeting hers. "Not what you need, but what you want. What would make you happy?" No one had ever asked Clara that question before. Her entire life had been about survival, about meeting the expectations of others, about making herself useful enough to keep. The idea of wanting something, of pursuing happiness rather than just avoiding misery, was almost foreign. "I want to belong somewhere," she said slowly, working out the truth as she spoke it. "I've spent my whole life being temporary. Temporary help in this household, temporary ward of that relative temporary resident of this boarding house. I want a place that's mine, a purpose that's mine, people who are mine. Samuel nodded slowly. Then we want the same things: partnership, purpose, family. That's a good foundation to build on. After breakfast, Samuel announced they would tour the ranch together. He led Clara to the barn where he saddled two horses, a massive black stallion for himself and a gentle butterscotch mare with kind eyes. "This is Daisy," Samuel said, stroking the mare's neck with surprising tenderness. "She's calm and patient, perfect for learning to ride." "Learning?" Clara asked, alarm rising in her chest. "I've never been on a horse in my life." "Then it's time you learn," Samuel said. "A rancher's wife needs to be able to ride. What if there's an emergency and you need to get to town? What if you need to help with the cattle? You can't do any of that on foot." "What if I fall?" Clara asked, eyeing the horse's height with trepidation. "Then I'll catch you," Samuel said simply. "I won't let you get hurt, Clara, I promise." He helped her mount, his hand strong and steady on her waist, lifting her into the saddle as if she weighed nothing. Clara gripped the saddle horn, her heart pounding as the mare shifted beneath her. "Easy," Samuel said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Daisy's not going to do anything sudden. She's the gentlest horse I've ever owned. Just sit up straight, hold the reins like this, and trust that she knows what she's doing." For the next hour, Samuel led Clara around the corral, teaching her the basics of riding. His patience was extraordinary, never showing frustration when she made mistakes, always quick with encouragement and gentle correction. Clara found herself relaxing, found the rhythm of the horse's movement becoming natural, found confidence building with each circuit of the corral. Midway through the lesson, Daisy suddenly shied at a shadow cast by a barn cat, and Clara's grip on the reins loosened. For a heart-stopping moment, she felt herself sliding sideways, the ground rushing up to meet her. Then Samuel's arms were there, catching her before she could fall, his strength steady and sure. "I've got you," he said, his voice calm, despite the flash of fear Clara had seen in his eyes. "You're safe." Clara's heart was pounding, but not entirely from the near fall. She was acutely aware of Samuel's arms around her, of the warmth of his body, of how protected she felt in his embrace. "Thank you," she managed. "Always," Samuel said, and the word felt like a promise. He helped her back into the saddle, and this time when she gripped the reins, her hands were steadier, her confidence bolstered not just by skill, but by the knowledge that Samuel would never let her fall. "You're a natural," Samuel said, with genuine pleasure in his voice an hour later, as Clara managed to guide Daisy around the corral without his help. "By spring, you'll be riding out with me to check the herds." The thought should have terrified Clara, but instead she felt a surge of pride. She was learning something new, acquiring a skill that would make her useful, that would make her a true partner rather than just a burden. After the riding lesson, Samuel showed her the rest of the ranch. The massive barn that housed 30 horses, each one with its own personality, that Samuel described with surprising fondness. The smokehouse where meat was cured for winter, filled with the rich scent of hickory and salt. The root cellar stocked with preserved vegetables, jars of pickles and relishes, and jams lined up in neat rows. The bunkhouse where his 3 hired men lived, a simple structure, but clean and well-maintained. He introduced her properly to Tom, Jake, and Pete, and Clara made a point of learning what each man did and asking intelligent questions about the operation of the ranch. She asked Tom about fence repair, Jake about cattle health, Pete about hay storage for winter. She listened carefully to their answers, filing away information, learning the rhythms and requirements of this new life. She saw the surprise in their eyes, the way they hadn't expected the boss's mail-order bride to take an interest in the actual work of ranching. But she also saw respect beginning to form, an acknowledgement that she wasn't like Samuel's first wife, that she might actually belong here. At noon, the Reverend Matthews arrived with his wife Dorothy and another couple from town as witnesses. The Reverend was a jovial man with white hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His wife was a plump woman with rosy cheeks and a warm smile that made Clara feel genuinely welcomed. "Don't you look lovely, dear?" Dorothy said, taking Clara's hands in her own soft ones, though Clara knew she looked exactly as plain as always in her brown dress with her hair pulled back severely. The ceremony was brief and simple. Clara and Samuel stood before the fireplace in the main room, repeating vows that would bind them together for life. Clara's voice was steady as she promised to love, honor, and cherish, though her hands trembled slightly. Samuel's voice was deep and serious, each word a solemn oath that Clara believed he meant with every fiber of his being. When it came a time for Samuel to place the ring on her finger, Clara was shocked to see him pull out a delicate gold band set with a small sapphire that caught the firelight like captured sky. It was my grandmother's, Samuel murmured, his voice low enough that only Clara could hear. I thought you should have something that means something. Something with history and love behind it. The ring fit perfectly, and Clara stared at it on her hand, her throat closing so tightly she had to swallow twice before she could speak. This wasn't just a practical arrangement to Samuel. He was trying to make her feel valued, treasured, part of something larger than herself. You may kiss your bride, Reverend Matthews said cheerfully. Samuel hesitated, and Clara saw uncertainty flicker across his face. Then he bent down, he had to bend quite far, and pressed a gentle, chaste kiss to her lips. It lasted only a second, barely more than a brush of contact, but Clara felt warmth spread through her entire body, felt something shift and settle in her chest. When he pulled back, his dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that stole her breath. All right, he whispered so quietly only she could hear. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. After the Reverend and his party left with good wishes and promises to visit again soon, Samuel returned to his work, and Clara began exploring her new home more thoroughly. The pantry was well stocked with flour, sugar, salt, dried beans, and other staples. The root cellar held potatoes, carrots, turnips, and apples enough to last through the winter. The kitchen was equipped with good cookware, cast iron pots and pans that had been well-maintained, sharp knives, and everything she would need to prepare meals for Samuel and his men. Samuel had clearly prepared for her arrival, had thought through what she would need, and made sure it was available. The realization touched something deep in Clara's heart. He hadn't just sent for a mail-order bride and expected her to make do. He'd actually considered her needs, her comfort, her ability to do her job well. Clara spent the afternoon cleaning and organizing, putting her own touches on the space. She found muslin and fashioned it into simple curtains for the kitchen windows, letting in light while providing a bit of privacy. She rearranged the cupboards in a way that made sense to her, putting frequently used items within easy reach. She found a chipped vase in the back of a cabinet, washed it carefully, and set it on the table, already imagining filling it with wildflowers in the spring. By evening, she had bread baking in the oven and a roast in a pot over the fire, determined to prove she could manage a household, that she was worth the faith Samuel had placed in her. When Samuel came in for supper, he stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the transformed kitchen. The curtains, the rearranged space, the smell of fresh bread, the table set with care. What's wrong? Clara asked, alarmed by his expression. Nothing's wrong, Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. It's just... He looked around, his eyes lingering on the small touches she'd added. It feels like a home. Clara's throat closed and she had to blink back sudden tears. Isn't that what you wanted? It is, Samuel said. I just didn't expect it to happen so fast. Sarah lived here for 3 years and it never felt like this. They ate dinner together and Clara found herself relaxing into conversation with Samuel in a way she'd never been able to relax with anyone before. He asked her about her life before Montana, really asked, with genuine interest and compassion in his eyes. So she told him about the orphanage where she'd grown up, the overcrowded dormitories, and the constant hunger, the fear of being unwanted. She told him about the various households where she'd worked as a servant, the long hours and harsh treatment, the way she'd learned to make herself invisible to avoid punishment. She told him about the aunt who had taken her in when Clara was 19, how for 3 brief years she'd thought she might have a real home. And then the aunt had died suddenly, leaving nothing but debts, and Clara had been cast out again, alone and unwanted at 23. You've been alone your whole life, Samuel said when she finished, his expression dark with something that might have been anger on her behalf. Yes, Clara agreed. I suppose I have. Me too, Samuel said quietly. Even when I was married, I was alone. Their eyes met across the table, and Clara felt something pass between them, a recognition and understanding. They were both people who had learned to survive on their own, who had built walls around their hearts because it was safer than letting anyone in. But maybe, just maybe, they could learn to let those walls down together. That night, after they had cleaned up the dishes together, working in comfortable silence, they sat by the fire. Samuel worked on mending a piece of tack while Clara hemmed a shirt she'd found that needed repair. The domesticity of it, the quiet companionship, felt more intimate than Clara had expected. Can I ask you something? Clara said, breaking the silence. Anything. Why did you really send for a mail-order bride? You're a successful rancher. You could have courted someone local, someone you knew. Samuel's hands stilled on the leather he was working. The women around here, they're afraid of me. They see a big, rough man who looks like he could hurt them, and they don't see anything else. Even the ones who might have been interested in the ranch and the security, I could provide. They weren't interested in the man who comes with it. That's their loss, Clara said firmly. Samuel looked at her in surprise, his dark eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether she meant it. You've been nothing but gentle and considerate, Clara continued. Yes, you're large, but that doesn't make you frightening. It just makes you you. And from what I've seen, you as someone worth knowing. Samuel's expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face. You're not afraid of me at all, are you? No, Clara said honestly. Should I be? Never, Samuel said, his voice heavy with feeling. I'd cut off my own hands before I'd hurt you, Clara. The intensity in his words made Clara's pulse quicken. She looked back down at her sewing, trying to calm her suddenly racing heart, trying to process the depth of feeling she heard in Samuel's voice. The days that followed settled into a comfortable rhythm. Clara woke before dawn as she had her entire life, but here there was no harsh mistress waiting to criticize her work, no fear of being turned out for the smallest mistake. There was just the quiet satisfaction of making a home, of being useful, of belonging somewhere. She learned the quirks of the wood-burning stove, how to bank the fire just right, so it would last through the night. She discovered that Samuel liked his coffee strong and black, his eggs over easy, his bacon crispy, but not burned. Small things, but they felt important ways she could take care of him, ways she could show her appreciation for the security he'd given her. Samuel, for his part, continued to surprise her. One evening he came home with a package wrapped in brown paper. For you, he said, almost shy. Inside were 3 books, poetry and novels, things she'd mentioned wanting to read during one of their evening conversations. Samuel, these must have cost a fortune, Clara protested. They're from the catalog, he said. Had them shipped special. Thought you might like them for the long evenings. Another time he brought home fabric and lace far finer than what she'd bought for the curtains. For a Sunday dress, he explained, you should have something nice for when we go to town. He brought her small gifts every time he went to town, ribbons for her hair, in colors that made her eyes shine, a delicate cameo brooch that had belonged to his grandmother, a music box that played a sweet melody. Each gift was chosen with care, with thought to what she might like, what might bring her joy. And one evening, he presented her with a jewelry box he'd carved himself, the lid inlaid with a pattern of wildflowers in different woods. When did you learn to do this? Clara asked, running her fingers over the intricate work. Winters get long, Samuel said with a shrug. A man needs a hobby. My father taught me when I was young. Haven't done much of it in recent years, but I thought I wanted you to have something I made with my own hands. Clara treasured that box above all her other possessions, not for its beauty, though it was beautiful, but for what it represented: Samuel's time, his care, his desire to give her something meaningful. He told her she was beautiful every single day. Sometimes it was casual, a comment as she stood at the stove stirring soup. You look pretty today, Clara. Sometimes it was more intense, whispered, as they said goodnight in the hallway between their rooms. You're the most beautiful thing in my life. Clara had never been called beautiful before. She'd been called useful, capable, efficient, but never beautiful. And the way Samuel said it with such simple conviction made her start to believe it might be true. 2 weeks after their wedding, Samuel announced they were going to town. We need supplies, he said, and I want you to pick out fabric for new dresses. That brown one is wearing thin. Samuel, I don't need new dresses, Clara protested. His voice was gentle but firm. Yes, you do, and I want you to have them. That's not a request, Clara. That's me providing for my wife the way a husband should. The trip to town was Clara's first real glimpse into how the community viewed Samuel and his new bride. People watched them pass with undisguised curiosity, some friendly, others judgmental. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson was less than subtle in her assessment. So, you're the mail-order bride, she said, looking Clara up and down with an appraising eye that Clara found both insulting and invasive. Brave of you, coming all this way to marry a man you'd never met. Before Clara could respond, Samuel stepped forward, his presence suddenly commanding the entire space. Mrs. Henderson, he said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. This is my wife, Clara Cross. She came here because she has courage and vision. And I'm the lucky one in this arrangement, not her. Clara felt her heart swell at Samuel's words, at the way he stood up for her without making her seem weak or needing protection. Something shifted in Mrs. Henderson's expression, a reassessment. Well, you've got backbone, both of you. I'll give you that. Let me show you the fabrics we have in stock. Samuel stayed close while Clara examined bolts of cloth, occasionally offering an opinion when she asked. She chose sturdy cotton for more kitchen curtains, a soft blue fabric for the parlor, some lighter material for bedroom curtains. Don't you want anything for yourself? Samuel asked. A new dress. Something pretty. Clara looked down at her worn brown dress, the one she'd carefully mended and patched to make it last as long as possible. This is fine. Clara Samuel's voice was gentle but left no room for argument. Pick out fabric for at least 2 new dresses. That's not a request. Clara's throat closed and she had to swallow twice before she could speak. Samuel, that's expensive. I don't need it. You do need it, Samuel said firmly, and I want you to have it. He turned to Mrs. Henderson. Show her the nicer fabrics, something that'll look pretty on her. Mrs. Henderson's eyes softened, and Clara saw understanding dawn on the older woman's face. Right this way, dear. Clara ended up with fabric for 2 dresses. One a soft gray that Mrs. Henderson insisted would bring out her eyes, and another a deep green that Samuel had quietly pointed to with a small smile. When they loaded the wagon, Clara noticed Samuel had also purchased yarn needles, a new set of cooking pots, and a beautiful quilt that had been on display. Samuel, this is too much, she protested. It's not nearly enough, he said quietly. You came here with 1 trunk and a threadbare coat. Let me provide for you properly. Please. The please undid her. Clara nodded, blinking back tears. On the ride home, Samuel was quiet for a long time before he spoke. I know what it's like to go without, he said finally. My parents died when I was 14. I worked other people's ranches for years before I saved enough to buy my land. I remember being hungry, being cold, having clothes so worn you could see through them. He glanced at her, his dark eyes serious. I don't ever want you to feel that way again. Clara's hand found his on the wagon seat, her small fingers curling around his larger ones. Thank you, she whispered. Samuel turned his hand over, engulfing hers completely, and squeezed gently. Neither of them let go for the rest of the ride home. Back at the ranch, Clara threw herself into her sewing projects. She made the curtains, transforming the house room by room. She braided rugs for the cold floors from fabric scraps. She arranged the few decorative items she'd brought with her, adding touches of warmth and personality to the previously stark spaces. One evening, as she sat by the fire working on the gray dress, Samuel looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. You're always working, he observed. Even when you sit down to rest, you're sewing or mending or knitting. I like to keep busy, Claire said. Idle hands and all that. When's the last time you did something just for yourself? Just for pleasure? Clara's hands stilled on the fabric. She genuinely couldn't remember. I don't know. Samuel set down his ledger and crossed to the bookshelf in the corner. He pulled down a worn volume and handed it to her. Do you like poetry? Clara opened the book carefully. The pages were yellowed with age, the spine cracked from frequent reading. Whose is this? My mother's, Samuel said, and Clara heard the emotion in his voice. She loved poetry. Used to read to me when I was small. He looked almost embarrassed. I'm not much for verse myself, but I kept it because it was hers. Clara's fingers traced the faded inscription on the inside cover. To my dearest Margaret, with all my love, John. This is precious, Samuel. Are you sure you want me to read it? I want you to enjoy it, Samuel says. She would have wanted that too. He returned to his chair. Read aloud if you like. I may not understand poetry, but I like hearing your voice. So Clara read, her voice soft in the quiet room, and Samuel listened, and something warm and fragile grew between them in that lamplight. 3 weeks after their wedding, the test came unexpectedly. Tom came stumbling to the house mid-morning with a gash on his arm from barbed wire, his face pale with pain and loss of blood. Samuel was out checking the north pasture. Jake and Pete had ridden to the far boundary to mend fence. Clara was alone, and Tom had no choice but to seek help from the boss's new wife. Mrs. Cross, he called weakly from the doorway, blood dripping onto the clean floor Clara had scrubbed that morning. I'm sorry to trouble you, but I didn't know where else to go. For a moment, Clara felt panic rise in her chest. Then she pushed it down and took control. Sit down, she said firmly, pulling out a chair and guiding him into it. Let me see. Mrs. Cross, I don't want to be a bother, Tom protested. Nonsense, Clara said, already heating water and gathering clean cloths. You're bleeding all over my clean floor. The least you can do is let me patch you up. She cleaned the wound, noting with relief that it was deep, but clean, not jagged. Her hands were steady as she worked, drawing on skills she'd learned during her year working for a doctor's family. She'd assisted with everything from setting bones to stitching wounds, and while she'd never enjoyed the work, she'd been good at it. You're pretty good at this, Mrs. Cross, Tom said, watching her bandage his arm with professional efficiency. I worked for a doctor's family for a year, Claire explained. Picked up a few things. This should heal fine as long as you keep it clean and dry. Change the bandage every day. If you see any red streaks, or if it starts to smell bad, you tell me immediately. Understood. Yes, ma'am, Tom said, clearly impressed. When Samuel returned an hour later and heard what had happened, Clara saw something fierce and protective flash in his eyes. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that alone," he said, his voice tight with worry. "What if Tom had been worse off? What if you'd needed help?" "But he wasn't, and I handled it," Clara interrupted gently. "Samuel, I'm not made of glass. I'm perfectly capable of managing an emergency." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You are, aren't you? I'm sorry. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "I worry about you." "Why?" Clara asked. "Because you matter to me," Samuel said simply. "More than you probably should after such a short time." Clara's heart raced. "You matter to me too," she admitted softly. The air between them felt charged heavy with things unsaid. Samuel took a step closer, and Clara felt her breath catch. She could see the want in his eyes, could feel the pull between them like a physical force. Then Samuel seemed to think better of it and stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should check on the cattle in the south pasture," he said abruptly. "I'll be back for supper." After he left, Clara stood in the kitchen, her hand pressed to her racing heart, acknowledging the truth she'd been avoiding. She was falling in love with her husband. This gentle giant of a man who treated her with such careful respect, who looked at her like she was precious, who made her feel valued and important and seen for the first time in her life. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a warm certainty that this was right, that coming to Montana marrying Samuel had been the best decision of her life. That evening, in one of the most profound conversations of Clara's life, unfolded by the firelight. Samuel had been quiet through dinner, thoughtful in a way that suggested he was working up the courage to say something important. "Clara," he said, finally setting down the piece of tack he'd been working on, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Of course," Clara said, setting aside her sewing. "Are you happy here? Really happy? Because if you're not, if you're just making the best of a bad situation, I need to know. I need to know if there's something more I should be doing, or if this arrangement isn't working the way we hoped." Clara looked at him, really looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear that she might be suffering in silence the way Sarah had. "I'm happier than I've ever been in my life," she said, and it was the absolute truth. "For the first time, I have a home that's mine, work that I choose to do rather than work forced upon me, a partner who treats me with respect and kindness. Why would I not be happy?" Samuel's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I just worry that you might be lonely, that you might miss having other women to talk to, or the excitement of city life, or all the things I can't give you out here." Samuel, Clara said gently, moving to sit closer to him. "I spent most of my life in cities surrounded by people, and I was more alone than I've ever been here with just you and your men. Loneliness isn't about how many people are around. It's about whether you feel seen, whether you feel valued, whether you matter to someone. And you make me feel all those things." Samuel's work-roughened hands reached out and took hers, dwarfing them completely. "You matter to me, Clara, more than I know how to say. I find myself thinking about you during the day, wondering if you're warm enough, if you're happy, if there's anything you need. I hurry through my work so I can get back to the house, back to you. I've never felt that way before, not even with Sarah." "I think about you too," Clara admitted. "I worry when you're out in the cold for too long. I find myself listening for your footsteps. I look forward to our evenings together more than anything else in my day." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, the fire crackling softly. Clara, Samuel said quietly, "I think I'm falling in love with you. I know it's only been a few weeks, and I know this started as a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way it became something more for me. You don't have to feel the same way. I just needed you to know." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I didn't expect to. I didn't think I was capable of it. But every day I find myself caring more, feeling more, wanting more than just a partnership." Samuel lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "What do we do now?" Clara smiled through her tears. "I suppose we keep falling." One evening in late December, about 3 weeks after their wedding, dark clouds began rolling in from the west. Clara stood at the window watching them, feeling the air grow heavy and oppressive with the promise of snow. "Storm coming," Samuel said, coming up behind her to look out at the darkening sky. "A bad one by the looks of it. I need to check on the cattle, make sure they're in the south pasture where there's shelter from the wind. Need to secure the horses and make sure everything's battened down tight." "Be careful," Clara said, and the worry in her voice was genuine and deep-rooted in feelings she could no longer deny. Samuel paused, then reached out and touched her shoulder gently, his hand warm through her dress. I'll be careful, I promise. I'll be back before the worst of it hits. She watched him stride toward the barn, his figure growing smaller against the darkening sky. The first snowflakes began to fall soft and lazy, at first, then faster, thicker, more aggressive. Within an hour, the wind had picked up, howling around the house like a living creature full of rage and hunger. Snow piled up against the windows, and Clara could barely see the barn through the white curtain of the blizzard. She paced the kitchen, keeping the coffee hot, the fire stoked high, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Where was he? The cattle should have been checked by now. He should have been back. The storm was getting worse by the minute, visibility dropping to nothing, the temperature plummeting so fast that ice was forming on the inside of the windows despite the roaring fire. Another hour passed, then another. The storm grew worse, the temperature dropping so fast that Clara could feel the cold seeping through the walls despite the roaring fire. She thought about Samuel out there in that killing cold, thought about how easy it would be to get lost just yards from safety, to freeze, to die alone in the snow. The fear that gripped her was unlike anything she'd ever felt before. This wasn't abstract worry. This was bone-deep terror for someone she loved, someone whose loss would shatter her world completely. She put on every piece of warm clothing she owned, preparing to go out and search for him herself. Consequences be damned. She'd rather die looking for him than sit safe and warm while he froze to death. Just as she reached for the door handle, it burst open in a gust of wind and snow. Samuel stumbled in, covered from head to toe in white, his lips blue with cold, his entire body shaking violently. Samuel, Clara cried out, rushing to him. Her hands moved over him, assessing the damage, feeling the ice that had formed on his clothes, seeing the dangerous pallor of his skin. Got the cattle moved. Samuel managed through chattering teeth that clicked together so hard Clara feared he might chip them. Got the horses secured, but the storm couldn't see 3 feet in front of me. Got turned around. Barely found my way back. If I hadn't seen the light from the window, I might have walked right past the house. His words were slurring badly, and Clara felt fear spike through her like a knife to the heart. She'd heard stories of men who froze to death after coming in from the cold, their bodies too far gone to recover their core temperature, dropped so low that warming them too quickly could kill them. You need to get out of these wet clothes right now, she said, her voice sharp with fear and command. Upstairs. Now, we need to get you warm. But when Samuel tried to move toward the stairs, his legs gave out completely. Clara caught him or tried to, but he was far too big for her to support. They both ended up on the floor in a tangle of limbs, Samuel's frozen body against hers. I'm sorry, Samuel said, his voice thick and slurred in a way that terrified Clara. My legs won't work. Can't feel them. Can't feel my hands either. Terror shot through Clara's chest, stealing her breath. Samuel, listen to me. You need to get warm now. Can you stand if I help you? Together, struggling and straining with every ounce of strength Clara possessed, they managed to get him up the stairs. It took 3 times as long as it should have, Samuel leaning heavily on the railing, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, Clara supporting what little of his considerable weight she could manage with her small frame. They made it to his bedroom, and Clara's hands trembled as she worked the buttons of his frozen shirt, peeled off his ice-crusted pants, got him under the quilts. But he was still shaking violently, his skin ice cold to the touch, his breathing shallow and rapid. It's not working, Clara said, fighting down panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. Samuel, you're not warming up. Your body temperature is too low. I'll be fine, he said, but his teeth were still chattering so hard he could barely speak, and his eyes were starting to look unfocused in a way that made Clara's blood run cold. Just need time. Just need to rest. No, Clara made a decision born of desperation and love. She quickly shed her dress down to her chemise and drawers and climbed under the quilts with him, pressing her warm body against his frozen one. Samuel's eyes went wide with shock, momentarily cutting through the hypothermic fog. Clara, you don't have to do this. Hush, she said firmly, wrapping her arms around him, her legs tangling with his, trying to share every bit of her body heat with him. This is about keeping you alive, not propriety. Now hold me. Hold me close and let me warm you. Samuel's arms came around her, and despite his chill, despite the fear coursing through her veins, Clara felt safe, felt right being in his embrace. They lay there together, her warmth gradually seeping into him, his shaking slowly subsiding over what felt like hours. Clara could feel his heart beating against her chest, could feel his breath warming against her hair, could feel the moment when life began to return to his frozen limbs. You're taking care of me, Samuel murmured after a while, his voice stronger now. wonder and something deeper coloring his tone. Of course I am, Clara said, tears sliding down her cheeks onto his bare chest. You're my husband, and I love you. I love you so much, it terrifies me. Samuel's arms tightened around her, pulling her impossibly closer. Clara, he said, his voice rough but no longer slurred. I need to tell you something. I've been trying to find the right time, but there is no right time, so I'm just going to say it. What is it? Clara asked, her heart pounding against his. This marriage, it was supposed to be practical, an arrangement to meet our mutual needs. But he stopped, and she felt him take a shaky breath that had nothing to do with the cold. I care about you more than I expected to, more than I probably should after only a few weeks. Every day I wake up grateful you're here. Every evening I look forward to sitting by the fire with you, hearing about your day, just being in your presence. Every time I hear your voice or your laugh, something in my chest just feels right, feels complete in a way it never has before. He trailed off, then continued with fierce determination. I'm making a mess of this, but what I'm trying to say is that I love you, Clara. Completely, utterly, with everything I am. Clara pulled back just enough to look at his face. In the dim light that filtered in from the lamp she'd left burning in the hallway, she could see the vulnerability in his eyes, the fear of rejection, the desperate hope. Why shouldn't you love me? She asked softly, echoing their earlier conversation. Why shouldn't you feel what you feel? Because you might not feel the same way, Samuel said. Because I don't want to pressure you or make you uncomfortable. You agreed to be my wife in name, to manage my household and help me build a legacy. I don't want to ask for more than that if it's not what you want. What if it is what I want? Clara asked, her own voice breaking with emotion. What if I love you too? What if I want to be your wife in every sense of the word, not just in name, but in heart and soul and body? Samuel went very still, his dark eyes searching hers intently. Do you really mean that? Yes, she whispered. I didn't expect to fall in love with you. I thought this would just be a business arrangement, like you said, a practical solution to our mutual needs. But you've been so kind to me, Samuel. You make me laugh. You listen when I talk, like what I say actually matters. You see me as more than just a plain, unwanted woman. You make me feel valued, important, beautiful, even when I know I'm not. You're not plain, Samuel said fiercely, his voice regaining its strength. You're beautiful. Every time I look at you, I think about how lucky I am that you're here, that you chose me. Your eyes, the way they light up when you smile, or when you're excited about something. Your voice, especially when you read poetry by the fire. The way you hum while you cook. The way you bite your lip when you're concentrating on your sewing. The way you tilt your head when you're thinking. Everything about you is beautiful to me. Clara felt tears streaming down her face now, years of believing she was worthless washing away in the face of Samuel's simple, honest conviction. Samuel, I know I'm not easy to be married to, he continued, his own voice rough with emotion. I'm too big, too rough around the edges. I work too much, and I'm not good with flowery words or grand romantic gestures. But if you'll have me, really have me as a real husband, not just a name on a marriage certificate, I swear I'll spend every day of my life trying to make you happy. I'll never hurt you. I'll provide for you. I'll protect you. And I'll love you with everything I have every day for the rest of our lives. The word love hung in the air between them, sacred and precious. And Clara realized that's what this feeling was. This warmth in her chest that had been growing stronger every day. This need to be near him. This fear she'd felt when he was out in the storm. This desperate relief now that he was safe. It was love, pure and simple, and terrifying and wonderful. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, feeling the roughness of his beard, the warmth returning to his skin. You already make me happy, every single day. You've given me everything I never knew I needed. Clara, he breathed her name like a prayer, and then he was kissing her. This wasn't like the chaste kiss at their wedding. This was deep and searching, full of weeks of restrained longing, of feelings too big to be contained any longer. Samuel's hands cradled her face so gently, as if she were made of spun glass and precious beyond measure. Clara's fingers tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, wanting more, wanting everything. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel searched her eyes with an intensity that stole what little breath she had left. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice rough with desire, but also with concern for her well-being. Because once we cross this line, I won't want to go back. I'll want you as my wife in every sense of the word, I'll want to wake up next to you every morning, fall asleep holding you every night. I'll want all of you, Clara, not just the parts you think are acceptable to give. I'm sure Clara said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. I want this. I want you. I want to be your wife in every way possible. I want you too, he said, his voice heavy with barely restrained passion. But we'll take this slow. I'll be gentle, I promise. The last thing I want is to hurt you or frighten you. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. I know you will be. I trust you, Samuel. I trust you more than I've ever trusted anyone in my life. Are you sure? His dark eyes searched hers intently, giving her one more chance to change her mind. We don't have to do this tonight. We could wait until you're more certain, until you've had more time to think about it. She kissed him again, pouring all her feelings into it, her love, her trust, her desire, her absolute certainty that this was right. That was answer enough. Samuel groaned against her mouth, his control finally fraying. Clara, if you want me to stop, tell me now, because in another minute I won't be able to. I won't have the strength to walk away. Don't stop, she whispered against his lips. Please don't stop. I need you, Samuel. I need to feel connected to you, to know that this is real, that we're real. And he didn't stop. He was careful with her, so careful, his large hands gentle, as they explored her body, learning what made her gasp, what made her arch into his touch, what made her cry out his name. He took his time, patient and thorough, making sure she was ready, that she was with him every step of the way. When they finally came together, Samuel watched her face, constantly checking for any sign of discomfort or fear. There was some pain at first. He was a large man in every way, and Clara was completely inexperienced. But Samuel went slow, murmuring words of encouragement and love, giving her time to adjust, waiting until the discomfort faded and was replaced by pleasure unlike anything she'd ever imagined. Move, she finally gasped, her nails digging into his shoulders. Samuel, please move. He did, and Clara discovered a whole new world of sensation, of connection, of intimacy that went far beyond the physical. This was what it meant to be truly one with another person, to give yourself completely and receive the same in return. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts. Samuel's body curled protectively around Clara's smaller one. She could feel his heart still pounding against her back, could feel his breath warm against her hair, could feel his arm heavy and secure around her waist. Clara, he murmured into the darkness, his voice soft and reverent. I love you, he said again, as if he couldn't say it enough, couldn't make her understand the depth of what he felt. I know it's soon, but I do. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first night when you looked up at me with those clear eyes and didn't flinch away, didn't see a monster, just saw a man. Clara turned in his arms, looking up at his face in the dim light. I love you too, she whispered. I think I have for weeks now. I was just too afraid to admit it, too afraid that if I acknowledged it, somehow fate would take it away from me. Afraid of what Samuel asked, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. That I'd lose this, Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. That somehow it would all disappear and I'd wake up alone again, like I always have been. I've been alone my whole life, Samuel. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else. Samuel pulled her closer, his arms strong and secure around her, sheltering her from every fear. You're not going to lose this. You're not going to lose me. I'm yours, Clara, for as long as you'll have me. For as long as I draw breath, I'm yours. Forever then, she said the word, a promise and a prayer. Forever, he agreed and kissed her again, soft and sweet, this time a promise sealed with tenderness. Outside, the blizzard raged on, the wind howling and the snow piling up in drifts that would take days to clear. But inside, wrapped in Samuel's embrace, Clara had never felt warmer or safer or more loved in her entire life. She had found her home, not in a place, but in a person, and that was worth more than all the riches in the world. The months that followed were a revelation to Clara. She'd never known life could be this full, this rich, this deeply satisfying. The ranch work continued through the brutal Montana winter, but now it felt like a shared endeavor rather than a lonely struggle. Samuel taught her more about ranching each day, patiently explaining the intricacies of cattle management, the importance of hay stores, the careful balance of feeding animals through the lean months. Clara discovered she had a knack for record keeping, and Samuel gratefully turned over the ranch accounts to her capable hands. She organized his haphazard system, creating ledgers that tracked income and expenses, breeding schedules for the cattle hay consumption rates. Samuel would come in from a long day of work to find Clara bone warm, Bent over the books, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, and his heart would swell with love and gratitude. "You're better at this than I ever was," he admitted one evening, looking over her neat columns of figures. "You're better at the actual ranching," Clara countered. "We each have our strengths. That's what partnership means." The hired men noticed the change in their boss. Samuel smiled more, laughed more easily, carried himself with a lightness that had been absent during his first marriage. Tom mentioned it one day while they were mending fence. "Boss seems happy," he said to Jake. The old cowhand nodded. "That's what the right woman does for a man. Makes him remember what he's working for." In late January, Clara woke up feeling queasy. She barely made it to the wash basin before she was sick, her stomach heaving even though it was empty. Samuel was at her side, immediately holding her hair back and supporting her with one strong arm around her waist. "Clara, what's wrong? Are you ill? Should I fetch the doctor?" Clara wiped her mouth with a trembling hand and looked up at him, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and fear. "I don't think I need a doctor." He frowned in confusion, his brow furrowing with worry. "But you're sick, Clara. You're scaring me." "Samuel," she said, slowly, carefully testing the words on her tongue. "I think I'm with child." His eyes went wide, his mouth opening and closing without sound for a long moment. "You're—" He couldn't seem to finish the sentence, couldn't quite wrap his mind around the words. Clara nodded, a smile spreading across her face despite the lingering nausea. "I think so. I've missed my monthly courses twice now. And now this," she gestured at the wash basin. "All the signs are there." Samuel's face went through a dozen different expressions in as many seconds. Shock, wonder, disbelief, fear, and finally overwhelming joy. He let out a whoop of happiness so loud, it probably scared every animal on the ranch, swept Clara up in his arms despite her protests, and spun her around the room. "We're going to have a baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Clara, we're going to have a baby, a child, our child." She laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "Yes, we are. Are you happy? Truly happy?" "Happy," he set her down carefully as if she were suddenly made of the most delicate porcelain and cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears on her cheeks that she hadn't even realized she was crying. "Clara, I'm beyond happy. I don't even have words for what I am. Blessed, grateful, terrified, overjoyed, all of it at once." Over the following months, Samuel became impossibly more protective. He insisted Clara rest more, hiring a capable widow from town named Mrs. Jenkins to help with the heavy housework. He worried constantly about her health and comfort, fussing over every twinge and pain. "Samuel, I'm pregnant, not ill," Clara protested one day when he'd practically carried her to a chair after she'd been on her feet for less than an hour. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know, but what if you fall? What if you hurt yourself? What if something happens to the baby?" His voice was tight with worry. She took his hand and placed it on her swelling belly, which had just started to show the gentle curve of new life. "Feel that? That little flutter." Samuel's eyes went wide with wonder. "I felt it. Clara, I felt the baby move." "Yes, you did," she said softly, covering his hand with hers. "Our child knows its father's touch already. This baby is strong, Samuel, and so am I. You need to stop worrying so much or you'll worry yourself into an early grave." Samuel sank to his knees in front of her chair, pressing his face against her belly, his arms carefully encircling her waist. "Hello in there," he murmured, his voice tender, in a way that made Clara's heart ache with love. "I'm your papa. I'm going to take such good care of you and your mama. You're the most precious thing in the world to us already." Clara ran her fingers through his hair, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion she felt. This man, this gentle giant, who'd been so alone for so long, was going to be a father, and he was going to be magnificent at it. But Samuel couldn't help worrying. This baby, this family, it was everything he'd never thought he'd have. A real home, a wife who loved him, and soon a child. The stakes felt impossibly high, the fear of loss almost paralyzing. One night, about halfway through her pregnancy, Clara woke to find Samuel sitting up in bed, staring at nothing in the darkness, his face pale in the moonlight. "Samuel, what's wrong?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he tried to find words for fears too terrible to speak. "I'm scared," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of what?" "Of losing you," he said, and there was anguish in his voice that broke Clara's heart. "Women die in childbirth, Clara. It happens. What if something goes wrong? What if I have to choose between you and the baby? What if I lose you both? What if I'm left alone again? Stop, Clara said firmly, sitting up and taking his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. Stop borrowing trouble from tomorrow. Yes, childbirth is dangerous, but women have been having babies since Eve. I'm strong and healthy. The midwife says everything looks good. You need to have faith. I can't lose you, Samuel said, and there was raw terror in his voice. Clara, I can't. You're everything to me. If something happened to you, I don't know what I'd do. I don't know how I'd survive it. Nothing is going to happen to me, Clara said, though she knew she couldn't truly promise that. Knew that childbirth carried real risks that no amount of optimism could eliminate. But Samuel listened to me. If, and this is only if, but if something did go wrong, you need to promise me you'll take care of our baby. You need to promise me you'll go on living, that you'll be the wonderful father I know you can be. You need to promise me you won't give up. Don't ask me to promise, that Samuel said, roughly, his hands gripping her arms almost too tightly. Don't ask me to imagine a world without you in it. I can't do it, Clara. I won't. I'm not going anywhere, Clara said, wrapping her arms around him, holding him as tightly as she could. I'm right here, and I'm going to stay right here. But you need to stop carrying this fear alone. Talk to me when you are worried. Let me help carry the weight. We're partners, remember, in everything. Samuel held her close, and she felt him shaking, this strong, capable man, terrified of losing what he'd only just found. That vulnerability made her love him even more. As her belly grew larger, Samuel adapted the house for her comfort. He built a cushioned chair with a footstool for the kitchen so she could sit while she worked. He made sure there was always water within reach. He rubbed her aching feet every evening, his large hands gentle on her swollen ankles, working out the knots and soreness with practiced care. Mrs. Jenkins became a godsend, handling the heavy work and helping Clara prepare for the baby's arrival. Together, they transformed the small room next to the master bedroom into a nursery painting, the walls a soft yellow that would work for either a boy or a girl, sewing tiny clothes and blankets from the softest fabric they could find, creating a beautiful cradle that Samuel had crafted with his own hands. Clara watched him work on the cradle night after night, his big hands careful with the delicate woodwork, sanding and smoothing until there wasn't a single rough edge, carving designs into the wood with painstaking precision, and she fell in love with him all over again. It needs to be perfect, he said, when she suggested he was spending too much time on it. Strong enough to last for all our children, God willing, but smooth enough that there's no rough edges. Beautiful enough that our son or daughter will want to keep it, pass it down to their own children someday. This cradle will be part of our legacy. The cradle, when finished, was a work of art. Sturdy oak with delicate carvings of horses and mountains along the sides, a scene of Montana life that would surround their child as they slept. Samuel had poured his love into every detail, and it showed. In early November, on a cold but clear day, Clara's labor began. It started with a dull ache in her back that gradually intensified, spreading around to her belly in waves that took her breath away. Samuel went pale when she told him, his face losing all color. It's time, he asked, his voice high with panic. It's time, Clara confirmed, trying to stay calm, even though her own fear was rising like a tide. Send Tom to fetch the midwife. And Samuel breathed. You need to breathe. The labor was long and difficult, stretching on for hours that felt like days. Clara had heard the stories from other women, but nothing quite prepared her for the reality of it. The hours of relentless pain, the exhaustion that made her feel like she couldn't possibly continue, the moments where she wasn't sure she had the strength to go on. Samuel paced outside the bedroom door like a caged animal while the midwife and Dorothy Matthews attended to Clara. His heavy footsteps back and forth, were audible through the door. Once Clara heard him praying aloud, his voice broken and desperate, as he begged God to spare his wife, to let her live, to not take her from him. When the pain became unbearable, when Clara cried out, unable to contain it any longer, Samuel couldn't stand it anymore. He burst through the door, his face wild with fear and determination. Sir, you can't be in here, the midwife protested, shocked by this breach of propriety. The hell I can't, Samuel said, his voice leaving no room for argument. That's my wife. I'm not leaving her to go through this alone. He went straight to Clara's side, taking her hand in his. Clara gripped it so hard she knew she must be hurting him, her nails digging into his flesh, but he never flinched, never pulled away. Don't leave me, Clara gasped between contractions that seemed to tear her apart. Never, Samuel promised, his voice fierce and unwavering. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. I've got you, Clara. I've got you. He stayed by her side through the rest of the labor, whispering words of encouragement, letting her squeeze his hand until his fingers were numb, wiping her face with a cool cloth, telling her how strong she was, how brave, how much he loved her. When she thought she couldn't go on, he was there, his presence anchoring her, giving her strength she didn't know she had. When the baby finally came after what felt like an eternity, when the midwife caught the tiny squalling infant, and the most beautiful sound Clara had ever heard filled the room, Samuel's legs gave out, and he sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands, his whole body shaking with relief and joy and overwhelming emotion. "Is she all right?" Samuel demanded, his voice thick with tears and exhaustion. "Is the baby all right? You have a healthy son." "Mr. Cross," the midwife said, her voice warm with approval and a hint of awe. "And your wife came through like a champion. That's one strong woman you've got there." Samuel's head came up, his eyes finding Clara's, and she saw wonder and love and gratitude shining in them. "A son," he whispered. The midwife wrapped the baby in a soft blanket and placed him in Clara's arms. She looked down at the tiny, perfect face, all red and scrunched up with a cap of dark hair, and his father's strong chin, and felt her heart expand to make room for this new all-consuming love. "He's perfect," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Samuel, look at him. He's perfect." Samuel stared down at the baby, this impossibly small creature, with tiny fingers and tiny toes making small snuffling sounds, and felt tears stream down his face. "He's huge," the midwife said proudly, her experienced hands gentle as she examined the newborn. "Nearly 10 pounds. Takes after his father, that's for certain. That's a healthy boy you've got there, Mrs. Cross." Clara smiled through her exhaustion and emotion. "I'm calling him James, after my father." James, Samuel repeated, tasting the name, letting it settle into his heart. James Samuel Cross. Samuel so carefully sat fully on the edge of the bed. Clara shifted little James into his arms, and Samuel held his son for the first time. The baby was so small in his hands, so impossibly fragile and precious. Samuel had held countless newborn calves, had cradled injured birds with broken wings, had handled delicate things before. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this moment, for the weight of this tiny life completely dependent on him, completely trusting. "I promise," he whispered to his son, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'll keep you safe. I'll be the father I never had. I'll make sure you always know you're loved. I'll teach you to be strong, but gentle, brave, but kind. I'll show you how to treat people with respect, how to work hard, how to love with your whole heart. You and your mama are my whole world now. Everything I've built, everything I am, it's all for you." Clara reached up and touched his face, wiping away the tears that streamed down his weathered cheeks. "You're going to be an amazing father. You already are." And he was. As the years passed, the Cross family grew. James was joined by his sister Emma 2 years later, her arrival bringing Samuel to tears once again. Then another brother, Michael, 2 years after that, completing their family of 5. The ranch house rang with laughter and the sounds of children playing, the patter of small feet on the wooden floors, the squeals of delight and occasional tears. Samuel taught his sons to ride and rope, to care for animals, to understand the land. And when Emma insisted she wanted to learn too, Samuel was just as patient, teaching his daughter, never once suggesting that ranch work was only for boys. Clara watched her husband with their children and marveled at how gentle this giant of a man could be. He let them climb all over him like he was a mountain to be conquered, gave them rides on his massive shoulders, read them stories by the fire at night in his deep rumbling voice. He was stern when they misbehaved, teaching them about consequences and responsibility, but never harsh, always fair, always making sure they knew they were loved, even when they'd made mistakes. And every night after the children were in bed, Samuel would find Clara and pull her into his arms, holding her close. "Still happy?" he'd ask, as he had 1,000 times before. "Still happy," she'd always answer, and it was always the truth. One evening, nearly 10 years after Clara had first arrived at Silver Creek Ranch, she stood on the porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Samuel came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head, a gesture as familiar now as breathing. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About that first day I arrived," Clara said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "How terrified I was. How certain I was that I'd made a terrible mistake. How I couldn't imagine how this could possibly work." Samuel's arms tightened around her, and now Clara turned in his embrace, looking up at the man who had become her whole world. His hair was starting to show threads of silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun and years of laughter. But to her, he was as handsome as ever, more so even because now she knew the depths of his heart. "Now I know it was the best decision I ever made," she said softly. "Coming here, marrying you, it saved my life, Samuel. It gave me everything I never dared to dream of having. A home, a family, a purpose, a love deeper than I thought possible. You saved my life too," he said seriously, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I was just existing before you came going through the motions. You taught me how to really live again, how to love again, how to hope again." From inside the house came the sound of the children arguing over something, James's voice rising above his siblings in typical older brother fashion. Emma's voice rose in protest and Michael started crying. "Papa James took my doll," Emma called out. Samuel sighed, but there was a smile on his face. "I should go referee." "In a minute," Clara said, pulling him down for a kiss. "Let them work it out themselves for once." So they stood there together on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, watching the sun set over the ranch that had become their kingdom, the home they'd built together from nothing but hope and hard work and love. And when Samuel whispered, "I love you," into her hair, Clara smiled. "I love you too," she said. "Forever." Forever, he agreed, and it was a promise they both kept every day for the rest of their lives. The mail-order bride who'd arrived with nothing but a battered trunk and a heart full of fear had found her home. And the lonely rancher who'd thought he'd never have a real family had found his heart. Together, they'd built something beautiful, something lasting, something worth every risk they'd taken to find each other. A love story written in the wild Montana territory where a gentle giant and a brave woman prove that sometimes the best things in life come to those who are willing to take a chance to be vulnerable, to open their hearts to the possibility of love, even when it terrifies them. And they lived happily ever after, just as they deserved, building a legacy that would endure for generations. Their love, the foundation upon which an entire family would stand.